And from their unwilling lips fell the great confession, Jesus is Lord.
Sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners.
William Wilberforce returned to his family, laying his head on his pillow. And remember, the slave trade is no more.
What comes to mind when you hear the word Methodist? If you're an American Christian, you're probably not thinking of anything too positive at the moment. The United Methodist Church especially has been going through it, trying to find their footing in an increasingly secular and changing world. But if all you know about Methodism comes from the past 5 to 10 years, you are missing out on one of the most world-changing movements in Christian history. I'm Joey Ellis, this is Christianity United, and today we're talking about Methodists who challenged systems, fought for the poor, and reshaped Christian activism as we know it. Let's start with John Wesley, Anglican priest, horseback riding theologian, and founder of Methodism. Wesley wasn't your typical 3-point sermon kind of guy. He was radical in his preaching. Wesley was deeply concerned that Christians, especially in his own tradition, the Anglican Church, were too satisfied with intellectually correct doctrine while neglecting to actually live a holy life. He saw people who could recite creeds and defend theology, but their personal lives were marked with indifference to the poor, apathy towards sin, and a lack of spiritual discipline. In other words, Wesley thought that Christians were too focused on believing the right things and not focused enough on becoming the right kind of people. And Wesley did a lot of different things to combat this, which inevitably led to Methodism. He organized people into different societies, basically like proto-small groups. And these small groups weren't just for prayer and reading scripture. In these societies Wesley formed, they would go out and feed the poor, visit the imprisoned, and hold each other accountable to holy living. Wesley said stuff like, "The gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness." Let that sink in. Social holiness. To Wesley, becoming holy, becoming Christ-like, is a social activity. Holiness in the Wesleyan mind means being concerned with other people's suffering. And members of Wesley's movement took this call to holiness seriously. If you joined a Methodist society saying, "I love Jesus," but neglected to help the poor, they would call you out and maybe assign you to go make some soup or something.
It's the best. I love it.
One of the boldest stances early Methodists took was on slavery. In case you didn't pay attention in history class, in the 1700s, slavery was a booming economy-driving norm. And yet John Wesley published Thoughts Upon Slavery, a scathing rebuke of the slave trade. He called the chattel slave trade absolute villainy. Wesley's last letter before he died, it was written to a guy named William Wilberforce, urging him to keep fighting the British slave trade. And by the way, Wilberforce ended up being a major player in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Meanwhile, in America, Methodists made opposing slavery a membership issue, meaning if you owned slaves, you were not allowed to be a part of the Methodist Church. Of course, many Christians were the ones promoting and taking part in the slave trade at that time. And this is a talking point that an atheist is going to bring up in an argument with you about Christianity. But the Methodist movement will show you that sure, it was Christians promoting the slave trade, but it was also Christians who abolished it. The Methodists didn't stop with slavery though. They were a part of everything. The Methodist movement has made great strides in education, healthcare, prison reform, labor rights. They built schools in rural towns where no one else would. They founded hospitals. They created orphanages where children were actually treated like humans. Wesley personally encouraged his followers to go visit prisoners. Not with the Bible to beat them over the head with, but with food, money, and letters from the prisoners' families. And it's not like members of the Methodist Church were huge wealthy elites with tons of time and money to spare. Most Methodists would have been coal miners, farmers, domestic workers, but they always gave what they had. Because for Methodists, caring about the least of these isn't just a simple act of charity, something to clean your conscience and make you feel good about yourself. It's obedience to God Himself. Fast forward to the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution is in full swing. And what's the result of this booming progress for humanity? Child labor, horrible living conditions, and economic exploitation out the wazoo. You've got Enlightenment philosophy to thank us for that one. Enter the Methodists, who preach tons of sermons against greed and excess, opened settlement houses, which is a prototype for our modern-day community centers, and pushed for labor reforms while standing with unions fighting for humane working conditions. In England especially, the Methodist movement gave birth to basically the modern labor movement. In the US, they created something called the social gospel movement, which combined evangelism with social justice. Were there excesses? Yes. And are there critics of the social gospel movement? Of course. But the guiding idea of Methodism that we can all get behind is that you can't love God and ignore your neighbor's suffering. But let's jump to the 20th century, because the Methodist movement just keeps on moving. One of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement is Reverend James Lawson, a United Methodist pastor and mentor to John Lewis, Diane Nash, and many others. Lawson studied Gandhi's nonviolence movement in India, came back to the States, and started teaching workshops to college students on how to resist injustice without resorting to violence. These workshops helped birth the Freedom Rides, the Nashville Sit-ins, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Martin Luther King Jr. himself name-dropped Lawson once, calling him the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world. Lawson was arrested more than once, not for preaching sermons, but for leading peaceful resistance to segregation and inequality. You're probably at this point thinking, okay, Joey, that's some great history, but look at the Methodist Church now. They just had a massive church split over LGBTQ inclusion. Clearly, they're not doing all that hot. And that's fair, I'll grant that. The United Methodist Church is pretty fractured at the moment, especially after the split in 2022. But despite the organizational chaos in Methodism, it's the individual members that are keeping the legacy of social holiness going. These aren't the Methodists you're going to see go viral on TikTok, but they're out there, loving Christ and bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth. If you have a local Methodist church that is faithful to God, Scripture, and especially the gospel, ask if there's anything you can do to help. I'm sure they got a laundry list of activities for you to take part. If there's not an option to do that in your town, like there's not in mine, just read up on Methodism and their history. Learn to appreciate them more. And you can watch some of my other videos on Christian unity if you'd like. Just putting it out there. And at the very least, in closing, I have a question I'd like you to consider. What would it look like for your life to be holy? Because if Christianity is going to stand out in our hurting and broken world, it's going to need more than just clever theology and good apologetics. Now, don't get me wrong, I love those things. But what our world really needs is Christians who are willing to get their hands dirty, like the Methodists have been doing for centuries. Flick! My chair! I'm Joey. This is Christianity United.